Thank you. You're hearing me? Is the mic on? Good. I'm delighted to be back in Singapore. This is my third trip. I've enjoyed each of them. I particularly love the food, I have to say. I'm also glad that I came to the earlier talks. I've been in a lot of conferences where speakers don't bother to listen. And of course, I sat there listening to Professor Chi, and he was in a very different form, making many of the points that I want to make about education. I will try, therefore, as I go over some of the same territory, to try to make other points as well, so that you don't feel like you repeat. On the other hand, a lot of my talk is about the role of narrative and persuasion, and of course, part of what Professor Chi was saying is that simply by talking to you, I'm not transferring information, that it's you who actually constructs that information. And so because my style was very different from Professor Chi's, maybe it's a chance for you to reflect on how different styles might influence different listeners. I don't presume to say that, that one will be more or less persuasive. I don't think that's really the case. I think we bring very different frames to talking about the same issues, and so it'd just be interesting for all of us to reflect on that. Also, I started with games, but I'm moving into a new topic. In fact, I'm talking about something today that I've never spoken to an audience about before, so I just want to say I trust you enough to take a risk of failing in front of you. But when I give talks like this, I find that, that I have to speak to three audiences at once, particularly if I'm not sure exactly who's in the audience. It used to be, when I first started talking about games, that everyone I spoke to were skeptics, were people who thought games, those are children's things. Why are you talking to me about games when we're here to talk about education? So that was the audience I used to speak to exclusively. For a while now, there have been a lot of new converts, people who have embraced the idea of games. Some of you may be new converts. Some of you may be the third category. Some of you may be skeptics. But of course, one of the issues with new converts is they're sometimes well-meaning, but haven't fully really assimilated the story, don't really fully understand what they've embraced. And I sometimes feel that, particularly in the last few years, for us in the US, a big change was this publishing of Jane McGonigal's book, Reality is Broken, which became a bestseller and really sold the idea of games to a lot of people, but I think in some ways in confusing ways, that confused the issues as to what's good about games. So finally, seasoned veterans, and that's where my sort of new area is. I think in the space of serious games or games for learning or persuasive games, there's now a growing body of people, and I know I've had a chance to talk that there are a number of you in the audience who've been at it for a long time, and our focus has largely been on the power of games. And I'm starting to think about other things besides games. Now, I'm not the only one thinking about it. I don't mean to suggest that this is all brand new and original thought, but I want to speak to that as well, if I can, in the 40 minutes that I have. But before I say anything, I want you to quickly turn to the person next to you and play a quick 2 out of 3 rounds of tic-tac-toe, right now, please. And if I'm serious, this is critical. If for some reason you don't have someone next to you, if you can't move and find someone, I want you to observe the audience. But quickly, do it quickly. 3 games of tic-tac-toe, come on. Be brave. Has anyone won one yet? Anyone win? All right, I'm going to keep talking. I sometimes know if I start talking too soon, people insist on keeping playing, which is fine. Actually, you are still playing, right? I can tell. How can I tell? Well, let me make my point. The point I want to make is tic-tac-toe is a stupid game, right? You learned by age 8 that it almost always goes to a draw. And yet, when I asked you to play, you all got very animated. There was a lot of laughter. There was a lot of noise. There was a lot of the kind of engagement that any of us would want to see in an audience. And so the point is, What is the power of tic-tac-toe? How does it have the power over us that it can get us that engaged when we know it's a stupid game? And I think we talk a lot about games, and we only talk glancingly about what I think is critical, which is the notion of play. And so I want to start with making an argument that we can't talk about games unless we talk a little bit more about play. And I would argue that play is the thing that we do when we don't have to do anything, when we don't have to do anything else, when we don't have to work, when we don't have to worry about survival, when we don't have to nurture somebody else, when we don't have to put food on the table, when we don't have to keep warm. That's when we play. And we play in lots of different forms. And by the way, although I think maybe because of computer games we're playing now more than ever, it's not anything new. I mean, this is only going back to the 16th century. This is Peter Bruegel, the great Flemish painter. This is a painting called Children's Games. And in it, he has illustrated over 100 games that actually were played in the Low Countries, in Belgium, what's now Belgium and Holland. At the time, scholars have been able to identify all these games. What's interesting about, by the way, I only go back to Bruegel, but of course there are Egyptian hieroglyphs showing game playing. There are Greek vases showing game playing. Archaeologists just discovered a game board from 5000 BC. So people have been playing for a long time. The interesting thing about this is they're not all just having laughs and giggles. There's every kind of human emotion and activity is expressed there, including very transgressive behavior, antisocial behavior, very social behavior. Games are not just something we do for fun. They're something that's deeply embedded in the culture. But not just games. I'm really arguing play. And it's not just people. We know from studies that animals play. Mountain goats play when they're not looking, again, when they're in their leisure time, when they're not looking for food, when they're not being hunted. They play a game in which they chase each other from rock to rock and cliff to cliff. And they do that in spite of the fact that mountain goats occasionally will fall to their death playing the game. Now, if you know anything about evolution, you know that a behavior that causes the deaths of individuals should die out, unless perhaps that behavior has benefits that outweigh the risks. So clearly what that might suggest to us is that mountain goats are using play to learn how to be mountain goats, how to jump, how to land. That may be true, and we might extend that when we think about cats and dogs, who we've all seen playing at hunting or fighting. And from those two examples, you might derive the conclusion that play is about kind of rote muscle memory. And it is sometimes about that. But they've done studies where they deprive kittens of the opportunity to play with other kittens. And it turns out when they grow up, they hunt just fine. They didn't need to play to learn how to hunt. They didn't need to play to learn the physical act of hunting. What they're no good at is interacting with other cats or making decisions. And so play is about building up a far more nuanced, networked idea of the world than just rote memory. One last cute animal. I keep going to cuter and cuter animals. Otters, they did a study where every time they swam through a hoop, they gave them a fish. Now, if you think about it, if you're an otter, if someone's going to give you a fish every time you swim through a hoop, you are wealthy beyond your wildest dreams. You have everything you need, right? So what does the otter do? It immediately starts swimming through the hoop upside down, backwards. It doesn't need to. It is really exploring the world. Exploring the world is sort of more important than just meeting its creature comforts. And that play is that process that never stops. It doesn't stop when you grow up, about exploring the world. And I'd argue that, to go back to Professor Chi's points, we learn about the world by constructing knowledge, not by being, it may be that and I'll talk about the ways in which things that are told to us may play a role, but in the end, it's we who construct the knowledge. And by going back to play, I think it's easier to understand that. So I just want to use a personal example of my own from pre-kindergarten, preschool. I played a lot with wooden blocks, and I can still remember the pleasure of discovering that 2 square blocks were the same size as 1 rectangular block, and that 2 rectangular blocks were the same size as 1 big block. The kicker was that 1 big block was the same size as 4 of the square blocks. And that relationship I started discovering was not just with those blocks. I could sort of replicate that around the world, and around my world. And so what I was doing right then and there was beginning to build up arithmetical, mathematical structures in my brain. I was wiring my brain to see the world as mathematical. I didn't know 2 + 2 = 4. That's just an algorithm. A lot of kids get to arithmetic and they learn the algorithm, but they never learn why. They've never had the opportunity to build up this kind of structure. But in fact, it's the play. And I ended up being a good math student, and I still think it's the blocks. I think it's the process of building up scaffolding concepts that happens in play before the formal introduction, so that when someone tells me 2 + 2 = 4, it's not just a bit of gibberish. It's actually just a convenient way of expressing what I already know. So now, math algorithms are just a symbol system that represent a far more rich understanding of the world, rather than a symbol system that I've got to learn to master to get to my next grade. Think about the difference between those two models. So I would argue that through the informal activity of play, we scaffold the ideas and the concepts that we are going to engage with formally in school and in life. And so that play is really the root of all education. But here's the challenge. One of the attributes of play is that a player's motivations are always entirely intrinsic and personal. The way we play is completely inner-directed. If I tell you how to play, it stops feeling like play. And so that raises challenge. In fact, I actually sort of like to categorize what I call the 4 freedoms of play. And to go over them fairly quickly, the freedom to explore. I mean, that's what I was doing with the blocks, right? I wasn't doing what the box told me to do with the blocks. I was exploring. I was just trying out lots of different things. Sort of along with that is the freedom to fail. Sticking with blocks for a minute, imagine you build a block tower and it falls down. That's when the learning has really started to happen, when the block tower falls down. What if you had a parent standing over a child saying, oh, that's a lovely tower, whatever you do, don't let it fall down. Imagine how much fun the child would not have. Right? Failure is a regular part of play, and it's a very painless part of play when you're a kid. Freedom of identity. When you're playing, think about now doll play for a second. A child, whether it's with dolls or Star Wars action figures, if you see what a kid actually does with them, they're actually acting out all sorts of roles. One character is good, one character is bad. They're really trying to inhabit both of those roles. They're trying to understand who they are in the world. They play at parent, they play at child, they play at dragons, because dragons are ways of thinking about their own darker impulses. They're doing all of that by inhabiting identity, and that doesn't stop with children. Carnival, if you've ever been to Carnival, that's adults playing with identity, playing World of Warcraft, or just having a different name on a web chat forum. We play with identity all the time. Finally, freedom of effort, which is just that play needs the freedom to be intense, relaxed, and to move between those two at any time. And those are all qualities that play has. So again, if the player's motivations are entirely intrinsic and personal, if all these freedoms are present, how do we channel play into learning activities? Because I'm arguing that it is learning, while still allowing for its open-ended nature. I mean, do we just set, I'm not arguing, at least in this room, that we just set kids loose with an infinite number of playthings and see what happens. It's okay for us to have goals for kids in terms of learning. But how do we use play? I think this is where games become powerful. And just to use one very quick illustration, golf. Anyone here golf? I find that in educational audiences, very few people golf. I don't either. But golf involves hitting a very small ball with a very long stick. And it's very hard. They don't have a single golf. Usually I can find one golfer to interview with this. Okay, good. So it's hard. It was hard when you first learned to golf, right? It's still hard. And you miss the ball a lot, right? At least when you first learn. Okay, now you're not missing it anymore. But then sometimes it'll go like 20. When you start to hit the ball, it'll go 20 feet, 30 feet. It goes off in the wrong angle. Even when you get theoretically good enough to play on a golf course, you're still knocking balls into the water, into the woods. In American dollars, that's $250 a ball. It's a miserable experience. And yet, it would be much easier, I think you'd agree, to pick up the ball and walk to the other end of the course and drop it in the hole. Because that's the point of golf, is to get the ball in the hole, right? So why do you take the single hardest way possible? And why do people, by the way, presidents, CEOs, people who can bill their time at $500 an hour, why do they waste hours moving that little ball into the hole in the most inefficient way? I mean, all games in the end are really that, are really the overcoming of unnecessary obstacles. Well, why do we do it? Because even golf shows us, as we start to do it, a possibility of mastery. And we sense that maybe we can master it. And then golf gives us feedback. The ball went a little further. I did better today than I did yesterday. That felt good. That swing felt good. So, in other words, golf is, and it gives us things we can measure in that feedback, whether it's strokes or every game does. So these people who have better things to do, the simple sense of potential mastery gets them back to the golf course. And that's true with whatever games you play too. So games are sort of a system for developing our will to mastery. They're powerful systems for that. In games, we willingly submit to arbitrary rules and structures in pursuit of mastery, but only if we can continue to be playful. All those freedoms I mentioned are still present in golf and in every other sport because we're still playing. And so there we are in that frame of mind at play where we're really constructing the world, but the game is sort of giving us channels in which to work in. So games have potential for sort of helping us master different things. So let's say giving more structure to our play. But here's the problem, and the problem is that that's nothing like what schooling looks like. The 4 freedoms of play are really the 4 freedoms of learning. That's what I've been arguing. But they're not the 4 freedoms of school as currently embodied, right? When are you allowed to fail in school? Where are you really allowed to explore? I mean, the curriculum is all laid out for you. When is there opportunity to say, oh, I'm really kind of interested in this minor historical character. Could I do research on him? No. Then you got to stick to the main points, right? That's true in every course. So really, it's not just the 4. They're not our notion of learning. In other words, we have this received notion of learning, which again, I realize I'm going over some of the same ground that Professor Chi did in a different way, when he talked about this notion that we're just data processors. That the data that I tell you will go into your head and it'll just sit there in your memory banks. If that were true, you'd all walk out of here having memorized his talk and my talk. You will have actually memorized neither. And in fact, there's a good chance that in recounting our talks, you'll say, forgive me if I'm presumptuous, that at least one of our talks you might say, that was really interesting. Oh, and by the way, Dave's talk too. I'm sorry, you were really going over the same ground too. So when I was listening to Professor Chi, I was really focused on, boy, I've got to really think about how I can relate what I'm saying to it. Anyway, but in fact, you may have some of the affect, but you'll have a hard time replicating the data. Because in fact, that's not what we're good at doing here. We're not really good at putting data in your brains. We're doing something else. And here's where I sort of shift from my, so anyway, I'm making a sort of quick argument for why games are essential for learning. And I want to sort of shift my dialogue a little bit to the new converts. Because I think what too often happens is we embrace the idea of games, and then we develop another model. And I was going to warn you before I showed the next image that it's disturbing, but compared to what Dying Dave, it's not so disturbing at all. But this is an image from the movie Clockwork Orange. How many know the movie, just out of curiosity? It's a Stanley Kubrick film from the early 70s, early 70s. And in this character, Alex, who's the main character, is a thug. He's a juvenile delinquent. In the course of the film, he murders somebody, but then he's arrested. By the way, it takes place in a dystopian future. So it's sort of a 1984-ish kind of world. He's arrested, and he's strapped into this machine, and he's programmed. And through aversive therapy, he's turned into a good citizen. And the reason I like this image is because I think too many people who've embraced the idea of games, this is their underlying model of games and learning. I'm going to strap you into my game, and when you're done, you're going to be changed. Which I think is also a problematic, model. In other words, we embrace the idea of games, but we haven't really embraced the notion of play and its freedoms. And so you get the stuff that the chemistry games that Professor Chi showed. My way of talking about that is we take the dead carcass of a game and we stuff it full of school content. The way it sort of presents itself in the serious games movement is that what the world needs is Grand Theft Calculus. So we're just going to we're going to take dull math lessons and we're going to skin them like a game and you're going to love it, right? But without playfulness, I think it's just going through the motions. It's just gym class. And in a minute I will illustrate it by showing a game that I think does it in a different way. So bear with me for just one more second as I make one additional point. So to me, the difference between typical education and serious games and good games is the difference between a spelling bee and Scrabble. Now, I don't know culturally whether spelling bees happen anywhere outside the US. Does everyone know what a spelling bee is? It's sort of a contest where you have to spell words. So think about the experience of a spelling bee. Most of you in a spelling bee are sitting there saying, I'm not very good at this. And you get nervous and your palms start to sweat. And eventually someone says, the buzzer goes off and you sit down and you're relieved to be done. But no one said, well, that was interesting that you spelled that word that way. Or I can understand why you spelled it that way because it rhymes with this other word, even though it's a different kind of spelling. Or you know why there's a GH in that word? There's a German root to that word. No, none of that ever happens. It's just you're wrong, sit down, you're right, you keep going. And at the end of the spelling bee, the kid in first place feels pretty good. Maybe the kid in second place feels okay. But that's about it. And what the rest of us have learned from a spelling bee is that we're not very good at spelling, right? Think about how school is run nowadays. Now, so I used to use this slide just to talk about games. But I realized I'm not just talking about games, I'm talking about school. Because think about how school is run. You keep going through it, and at some point, so in the United States, 7% of the population graduates saying that they're good at math. 7%. Which means, because every year, someone hit another wall. I was good at arithmetic, but now I don't understand algebra. I was good at algebra, but I don't understand geometry. So I'm no longer good at math. And so we peel people away one by one. Nope, you're wrong, sit down. And at the end, only 7% feel good about it. And so what have we done? We've taken 12 years to teach people that they're no good at math. That's such an hour a day for 12 years saying you're no good at math. It is so inefficient. We should just tell them in kindergarten, let them do other things. Or we should figure out how to make math meaningful in the ways that math is meaningful, because I think it is meaningful. Now, a game of Scrabble. In a game of Scrabble, you're putting your tiles on your board, you're moving around, you're thinking about all the words you know. There's always a moment in the game when someone plays a funny word, and there's a joke, there's laughter. Someone says meese is the plural of moose, like geese is the plural of goose, you know, that kind of thing. Or there's bluffing, there's trying to make up words, seeing if we can get away with it. All that's fun. I never beat my wife at Scrabble. So when I play against her, what I play to do is to get the biggest word score I've ever gotten, or to get the highest score I've ever gotten. So remember, like I said about golf, there's all sorts of feedback, all sorts of ways of measuring mastery. There's not just one path to success in Scrabble. There's lots of different ways for different learners to be invested in the game and to get their own meaning from the game. And that's really what we should be thinking about. Around the time that Bruegel did the painting, we find for the first time in print in the English language, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Now, at first glance, we all want to agree with that. But I think there's a problem with it, which is that it starts out on the assumption that there's work and there's play and that they're opposites, and that in school that means there's learning and there's fun, and those are opposites. Now, fun here, I want to be clear. Fun, yes, to the person who makes it this way, fun is giggles. It's a ride on a roller coaster. It's being tickled, or whatever it is, but think about a kid playing a video game. A kid playing a video game, his eyes are crossed, his tongue is sticking out, he's yelling at the screen. He says, that's not fair, in the middle of it. Then he solves the problem, and he says, that was fun. Fun can be hard. I sometimes mention Macbeth. When I see Shakespeare's Macbeth, it's a dark, brooding play. It's all about the worst in human nature. It's deeply engrossing. On some level, it's fun. In some real sense, it's fun. It holds me for 2.5 hours. So we need to stop thinking about learning and fun this way and think about it this way. And think about what we can do in that corner. So I said I was going to try to illustrate my point about using games to sort of construct knowledge rather than to just convey knowledge. So I'm just going to talk about a game that we developed at MIT called Lure of the Labyrinth. It is free. You can go online and play it. It is for middle school in U.S. mathematics, which is pre-algebra. Just to give you a sort of a sense of it, the game is a long-form adventure game. But you can play from any computer you log on, and it'll save your state. So, so you get involved in this story. It's all told through comics. I love comics. It's also, it was also an easy way to do production, but I actually think this game is also about literacy, and I think 21st century literacy means knowing how to meld text and images in meaningful ways, and so I think comics are a really valuable way. It also makes the game accessible to challenged learners as well as more experienced learners. One thing about this game, it's done in Flash, and this character is you. You get to customize your avatar, and we can insert whatever avatar you have right into the comic book. So even though everyone's reading the exact same comic, it's personalized. Anyway, the story is, very quickly, you were a kid, you were walking your pet at night, you were going out to get pet food, you tied up the pet outside of the store while you went in to buy the pet food, and while you did, somebody kidnapped your pet. You come outside, you follow the trail, it leads you underground. You spend the game in this underground factory that's inhabited by monsters. You're in a monster costume yourself because you have somebody helping you. And you're doing all sorts of jobs in the factory while discovering where the pets have all been kidnapped, and you're going to, in the end, sort of save the world. But it's a humorous game. It doesn't presume that your character is always Superman. In fact, you have lots of setbacks. You're a real kid. And so we're going to quickly play the game right now. I'm going to make you all play it. Okay? Hold on a second. I got to do this. Just got to move this over here. I'm going the wrong way. There we are. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to tell you almost nothing. Let me put up the audio here. I'll put the microphone near it. Oh, the microphone's gone. All right. I'll just try to hold my microphone near it. Anyway, all you know at this point in the game is that somebody said you should go to the factory break room. And when you get to the factory break room, oh, sorry, I should do this, should I? You meet a large gelatinous monster with no arms, and it asks you if you can get it something out of the vending machine. And that's all you know. So with that information, tell me what to do. I'm just going to be your hand, but you're all playing the game. You got to shout out. I've got to find the cursor here. Oh, there it is. Okay. Tell me what to do. Come on. Oh, the mic's there. Good. So it doesn't roll off the table. The sound isn't that important, but it does add something. Come on. Tell me what to do. You're not getting it? Drag the apple. Okay, good. So yeah, if you're a kid, the first thing you do is start clicking around the screen, and what you discover is that clicking on this stuff doesn't seem to work. So now what should I do? This stuff? Yeah, they don't drag. Oh, the right? Oh, in the pouch. Okay. Oh, that picks up. Okay. What should I do? Up there. Okay. Now what? Okay. So, all right, so you got some gross, I think it's snails. This is monster food after all. So, okay, what should I do now? Come, what? I can't hear you, I'm sorry. Oh, click on the thing I just got. Okay, nothing happens. Try 3 pinks. Oh, okay. So I want to just point out, do you have you have a reason for that, right? You're not, okay, don't say it again. But I just want to point out what's just happened. You came into a situation that was totally chaotic, didn't make any sense. You didn't know what to do. No one told you what to do, so you started probing. You got a little bit of feedback, which is that one thing you clicked on it, something happened. So you tried something, you got a result, and now you actually have what we might call a hypothesis, right? So out of nothing, we suddenly have a hypothesis. Out of observation, probing, now we're going to test our hypothesis. So I said this is a game about math, but we're just doing science here. In fact, I'd argue that all games, all good games, have a very similar process. You don't understand a system. It gives you some amount of information. You probe, you get feedback, you form ideas, you start testing those ideas. Kids know how to do that without any instruction. What no one ever does for kids is say, you know, when you solved that puzzle in, and then it could be any game, including Grand Theft Auto or, you know, whatever game you want to be horrified about, any game you can say, any good engrossing game, you can say, when you solve that problem, you were doing what scientists do, what historians do. You actually are smart. You actually have power, capabilities. You have powers. Instead, we say those are child's play. We tell kids to divorce all of those instincts from scholarship, when in fact that is that is what scholarship is about. Anyway, so why did you say 3 picks? So your hypothesis is that the colors had different values, and therefore if you put 3 pink, you might be able to deduce a value. Okay, so going with that, so it seems maybe it worked because that number is divisible by 3, right? The 9. So let's go. Shall we keep going with that hypothesis for now? Okay, what should I do? I'm sorry?
Singapore Primary 2 math modeling.
They do that in Singapore?
Exactly this.
Good. So this is done in Singapore Primary 2 math. Okay, so what should we do now? So we said 3 blues? Sorry, I heard blue before I heard green. Sorry for those of you who prefer green. So we even think we know what green is now, huh? So I just want to point out, should we go on? Do people want to solve this, or are you satisfied that you understand? Okay, good. Sometimes if I stop, the audience gets really mad, which is fine. I mean, it's like tic-tac-toe, right? But in fact, this is a game about variables, about learning to solve for x. Now, nowhere in this game do we say variables. And I don't want to say variables in the game. What I want to have happen, actually this game is designed so kids play it outside of school. They play it at home. What I want to have happen is that a teacher walks into class one day and says, I want to introduce a new word, variables. How many know the word? And maybe one kid raises their hand, 2 kids. He said, then she puts this on the projector and says, well, you all played this. How did you solve it? And she starts a conversation. And so instead of introducing new subject areas as things that, here's your chance to fall off the table with math, right? Here's where you're going to stop being good at math. Instead, it's, here we're building on things that you've already discovered about the world. It goes back to my original point. Games as ways of they've already constructed the model before you formalize it. Now, I totally agree about the role of dialogue. I would never I would argue that some small percentage of kids playing these games immediately connect them to their studies. But I don't think it's a failure of the other kids who don't. I think that's why there is a role for school, and there is a role for adults, and dialogue. And so dialogue is the way in which we help kids make sense of what they're discovering through their own devices. But we're building on their experiences. We're not delivering experiences to them. We're letting them develop these experiences. So this is just one game, and there are countless games that do it in lots of different ways. I don't need to argue for any one specific but the point of the matter is, this game is not about as much as it's about variables. It's about the process of being a problem solver. By the way, the answer is different every time you play it. So you can't tell your friend that blue is 7. The game does have a chat system because kids are on teams and they're playing competitively against other teams. All they can talk about is their strategy. So inside the game, kids have to read and write about their thinking. They have to begin that dialogue process. So that is in fact what's going on in the game. Is we are really trying to make explicit problem solving and strategic thinking, and I think good games do that. And that's where, but again, there's a role for education in that too. So where I want to go now in the time that's left is go back to the slides here. Give me a second. Turn off this game. I've got to find my cursor again. Okay, here. All right. I think I want to talk about sort of a new direction, at least for me, to thinking about games. I think Professor Chi and I would both agree that this is not a very good way of transmitting information, just through a lecture. It's part of why I have you play games, in fact, is so that it's not just listening to me talk. But I think there's something interesting. So those of us in the game space who've thought largely about the way we can create activities that are meaningful, I've been thinking a lot. My background actually it was actually before, because I'm too old. Like, I only graduated college the year the Atari came out, so I didn't grow up playing electronic games. I studied theater in college and started life in television. And so storytelling has always been important to me. In games, by and large, we have really focused, good games, I think, have tended to focus more on the game activity than on the storytelling. And for good reason, for being suspicious of trying to be too didactic. But I want us to think a little bit more about the role of storytelling. When you have a good storyteller, yes, it's not like that lecture. These kids are leaning forward. As this storyteller is telling a story, they're actually filling in the details. They're relating the story to their own experience. They're beginning to construct their own version of that story. So they're not just passive listeners. So just as games help us construct knowledge, I think there are ways that we haven't fully, in the game space at least, haven't fully asked, how can stories also help us construct knowledge? And in fact, if you think about children playing games, they not only listen to other people's stories, they then begin enacting stories. And so I want to, an errant slide just got into my presentation, so forgive me for this one. A couple errant slides. What's going on here? I have to find out what happened to my, oh, I know what happened. Okay. I was started the wrong, I had a second presentation with that. Let me get back to the right one here. Okay. So, talking about storytelling. What would you do if I showed you this? Sorry? Try to crack the code. Right, okay. Now, some of you may not have thought of that right away, but probably over time, when I have more time, I ask people to sit together and try to figure out what's going on here. And in fact, it is a code. And if I give you enough time, you'd actually maybe even figure out it was a Caesar cipher, and some of you might begin to solve it. A Caesar cipher is a simple rotation cipher, A equals B, B equals, or something like that. Anyway, so this one asks the question, how many cups of coffee are drunk in the United States in a day? And then I ask audiences to do that. And they put their heads together, and they all come up with answers which, believe it or not, tend to be of the right order of magnitude, even if they don't have the internet. At least they come up with an answer of the same order of magnitude that the internet tells you, which is 400 million. So what's the point of that? I'm trying to get at a kind of game that we developed. We're calling it a curated game that we developed at MIT, and we did it with the Smithsonian Institution, which is the National Museum in the United States. I don't know whether you all know it. If you go to Washington, all the museums are part of the Smithsonian. Anyway, the way the game started, it was advertised as the MIT Smithsonian science game. And kids logged in on day one, and what they discovered was this broken up video of some undergraduate saying, well, we had this game plan, but somebody hacked our server, and the game isn't working, so we need your help solving what's going on. And we created a website where you can talk to each other. So the 6,000 kids who signed up to play the game got on the website and started talking, and some of them said, did you see the codes that flashed in the video? And some did and some didn't. But once they started comparing notes, they all discovered the codes. It took them about 2 days to break the code, but they did. And that started them on a whole series of problems. I don't have time to go through it all, but basically they spent 8 weeks unraveling one science mystery after another that led to a whole science fiction story about a future world which has been ravaged by global warming and which life has seemed to have disappeared, all sorts of things. I mean, it has a happy ending, don't worry. But not before getting very dark. But the point was, it wasn't really, we called it a game, but it really wasn't a game. It didn't have the formal structure of a game. There were no rules. There wasn't the kind of organized feedback. There was no winner. What it was a story. And it was a story that asked the players to interact with them. It was an interactive story, but it was nevertheless a story. And in the course, and the kids knew within a half an hour or within a day of the game that it was fiction. They knew that the server hadn't really been hacked. But toward that end, these kids did all this serious scientific work. And they did it, I would argue, because it was a story. They did it because the story gave them a way to imaginatively project themselves into a world in which, and I don't have time, I'm going to try to be respectful of your time, which they visited museums, they collected data, they did archaeology, they talked to scientists, Smithsonian scientists on air, online. I mean, they did all the work of science, all in the service of filling out a story. And what I'm sort of exploring is the question of imaginative projection, of the way in which stories invite us to project ourselves into worlds, even when we're not doing games. And so my point in bringing this up is to say that we're just at early days. In the recent months, 2 new games have come out, Dear Esther and Gone Home. I'm suddenly blank on the name of it. But both of them are barely games at all. They're just interactive stories. And I think that the potential there is something we all ought to be exploring as ways of thinking not just about the knowledge we construct through the mastery of games, but through the ways we project ourselves into stories and create stories. And so I would go on at more length, but I realize I've run out of time. So I'll just take, do I have time for a question or two, or should I? Should I? Take a question? Okay. Any questions?
Thank you for sharing with us your games.
Yes.
In addition to Labyrinth, what would you consider your more successful games?
Most successful? I don't.
And what were the elements that contributed? I mean, you mentioned some of them. What were the elements that made it more successful than others?
I mean, the most successful games are games in which the challenge is authentic, in which what you're doing is not learning facts, but rather learning to reflect on your own thinking strategies, to solve problems, to explore, to do what I just described of making sense out of something that doesn't make any sense. I suppose the one that I did a series of games called Zumbinis, which are hard to find now, but you're all about mathematical logic, which I guess I'm sort of happiest about. And they also, I think the role of story was powerful in them too. So anyway. Other questions? I should really give the floor to the next group, but thank you very much.